Happy Wednesday, New Orleans Saints family and fan base, and a special happy Wednesday to our Bayou Blitz family. And hey, for all those who celebrated, happy belated, Independence Day to you. I hope everybody had a safe and productive holiday. But on to better, brighter things. I am Bob Rose. I am one of your co-hosts to your Bayou Blitz podcast. Joining me is my partner, my friend, and someone who looks like he's at home this evening, Brendan Boylan. How are you, Brendan?
Good. Not traveling this week. Well, traveling later in the week. Seeing family for my birthday this weekend. But no, it's nice. It's nice to not be in a hotel room. It's nice to have like stable internet. That's a pretty great thing. But nonetheless, yeah. Happy to be here. Happy to talk some New Orleans Saints, even though it's been a little dry in terms of what's been going on as of late. But we certainly every week have content for you guys. Last week we talked about offensive players on the roster bubble. Today we're going to talk about some defensive players and also throw some names out there that are still remaining in free agency because you see some teams making some really small moves, and I expect the Saints to do so, especially as we inch closer to training camp. But there's not a lot of teams that have the same amount of cap space that the Saints have to play with. So could the Saints make a surprise splash? We'll certainly get to that as well. But Bob, before we get too far ahead talking about the Saints, you talked about Independence Day yesterday. Burgers, hot dogs. What was day at the pool? What was going on in the Rose household?
We did absolutely nothing, Brendan. I made barbecue chicken, but I couldn't grill it because we don't currently have a grill. So I did it on the stove in the oven. I have a way of doing it that I wrap them in foil and I baste them every 15 to 20 minutes. So I mean they come out with the literally falling off the bone, like a good barbecue rib. So the family always likes it. But yeah, I mean we're not the type of people. We don't drive out of our way to fireworks. We could see 3 or 4 different townships from our back porch, off in the distance with their fireworks show. So we've watched those for a few minutes, and then it's just a regular day for us. What about you? What about you and Katie?
Hung out with her family, burgers, a little bit of time at the pool. Went to the next town over. Their minor league team had a fireworks show after the game, so we didn't go to the game. We just hung out in town. We're able to watch some fireworks after we had something to eat. But nothing crazy. Even though I'm in my mid-20s, I'm not one of those people that goes out and does these crazy parties and whatnot. But hopefully everybody stayed safe and well, because I know a lot of crazy things happen over the 4th of July holiday, especially if you, live close to the water. So hopefully everybody's safe and sound, and we're happy to have you back here on a Wednesday night. Bob, let's just dive right in. You and I kind of joked about it before we got on. Let's, talking about some potential free agents. Let's go ahead and throw the unrealistic free agents out there. And then we can kind of reel back in and talk about some that you might have on your short list for the New Orleans Saints. Oh, it's getting serious. Professor Bob popping one out. So I think the unrealistic ones, free agents / trade targets, right? There was a lot of hoopla about Hunter Renfrow for a little bit. I think at this point that is I don't want to say completely off the table, but I'd say 98% sure that he's not going to be a New Orleans Saint. And that kind of falls in the same realm as the next player I want to talk about, and a guy that I'm actually surprised is still available at this point, and that's DeAndre Hopkins. I know he's taken some steps back, obviously lost a step over the years, but certainly a guy that has continued to produce as a really good wide receiver in this league. I know the Patriots have shown interest. I know division rival Carolina Panthers have shown interest, specifically since Hop is from the Carolina area and went to Clemson.
Yeah.
Do you see any possibility that there is a receiver in the Saints' future? We joked last week when we talked about roster bubble cuts that you have your 3 guys, you have some veteran guys, and you have a ton of guys that are like, well, that's a really good, camp body, or that's a really good guy to be the back end of your roster. Is there anybody else that you could see the Saints potentially going after when you look at your free agency shortlist right now?
I'll tell you, and let's start at receiver. And I know what I said last week about outside of Olave, Shaheed, and Michael Thomas, literally everybody else in that receiver room is on the roster bubble. And I see that being the case through training camp. I agree with you. I do not see. I really never could realistically see a trade for Hunter Renfrow to begin with, and I really don't see it now. It looks like he's going to be a Raider this year. If he does get moved, it'll be during the preseason. Maybe on the eve of the regular season. When we have seen players get moved before. If another team really struggles with their receivers or has a couple injuries to veterans, that's the only way I see Hunter Renfrow getting moved. Not just to the Saints, but anywhere at all. But DeAndre Hopkins, I kind of agree with you to an extent that I'm a little bit surprised that he hasn't signed yet. He's going to end up going to the highest bidder, and there is probably a bidding war going on behind the scenes right now. He is making a world tour. I believe the Buffalo Bills are in the running too. The New York Jets, I have heard, have shown at least outside interest or interest through the media, because of their acquisition of Aaron Rodgers. They obviously want to sign, the overrated Rodgers, or bring in as many weapons as they can for the overrated Rodgers. So that way he has plenty of people other than himself, to blame for his failures for the 2023 season. But I can't see DeAndre Hopkins being pursued by the New Orleans Saints either. His price tag is going to be too high. There are already going to be a bunch of shared targets. And I frankly, I don't think DeAndre Hopkins is an elite wide receiver anymore. He's still very, very good. Certainly in the top half of, wideouts in the league. And easily, even if Michael Thomas is back at 100%, Hopkins is, easily a 2 or a 3 on this team. But I think the price tag is too high. The risk-reward ratio is too high. Even if you bring in D-Hop on a 1-year prove-it-to-me deal, a 1-year mercenary deal, as it looks like he's going to end up signing for. He's been suspended already multiple times for PED violations. He's literally one PED screw-up from being lost for the year, which means you brought him in off the street, you reshuffled your roster for absolutely nothing. I don't see the New Orleans Saints taking that kind of risk, even at a receiver position that is going to be awfully, awfully thin if Thomas continues to struggle with the injury woes that have plagued him the last 3 years. So at receiver, the 2 big names that you mentioned, either via trade Hunter Renfrow, I can't see it happening, or blockbuster, a splashy deal, DeAndre Hopkins. Cannot see that happening. I wrote last month about Dalvin Cook being a possibility. Now, I realistically don't see that happening either. I think, Dalvin is currently taking his free agency world tour. The only way I see Dalvin Cook to the Saints being a potential option is if Alvin Kamara whose hearing is, remember, July 31st. If that thing gets wrapped up relatively quickly after that, and he's going to serve a lengthy suspension, and I mean 10, 12 games, perhaps the whole season, at that point, if a Dalvin Cook is available, you at least sit down with him and talk to his reps if he's still available. I don't talk to him ahead of time because I brought in Jamal Williams. I drafted Kendre Miller, and you have Taysom Hill as a legitimate backfield option too. We poked a lot of fun at Pro Football Focus a couple weeks ago for their backfield rankings. You look at this, even with a pending suspension to Kamara, you look at Kamara for 10, 12 games being available. Jamal Williams, what we think is going to be the player that Kendre Miller is hopefully going to be. This is a damn good backfield, and I don't see that. I don't see them tipping the boats, the lifeboats in either direction by trying to bring in Dalvin Cook either.
Yeah, I think offensively, there's not a lot of positions the Saints could go outside of offensive line that would make a lot of sense in terms of bolstering their depth ahead of training camp. And frankly, the free agent class is kind of on, I don't know, wave 4 or 5 at this point, right? It's not wave 1, it's not wave 2, it's not even after draft waves. You are scraping the bottom of the barrel at this point. For some guys, unless you have a surprise cut prior to training camp, which very rarely happens. A lot of times you'll have a surprise cut in the middle of camp, but all that could change this year too, Bob, because there's only one round of cuts, which makes things, I think, a little bit more fun. I actually like it more that way. Some people may not. I like the drama of it. Right. I think, and that's what the NFL is going for, right? Just like any league, how much more money can we make? How can we make it a reality TV show? Which everybody says the NFL, the NBA, those are the greatest reality TV shows of all. So I don't know. I don't know what I see the Saints doing defensively. I could still see defensive line depth. I could still see linebacker depth, which is a position you and I have harped on for lots of this offseason. I don't see a spot where they're bringing in any more safeties. I think they've done plenty of that. Bringing in some depth at DB, maybe at corner, but they're pretty good there too, right? So for a team that has missed the playoffs the last 2 years, the Saints are oddly in a good spot when you look at the roster on paper, which is a really positive thing. So let's get to some roster bubble players. And certainly, guys, if you have questions about specific players or you want us to touch on a specific position, just drop it in the comments. We're happy to talk about it here this evening. Bob, like I said, we talked about the offense last week. Defense becomes a little interesting, because it has been the heart and soul of the team for the last 2 years. A lot of returning faces, some newer faces, some players that are going to be fighting for positions that have become void because guys have left. And then you have positions that you think you found your replacement, but you're not 100% sure either. And we're not talking about little positions. We're talking positions like linebacker. We're talking about positions like defensive tackle for a team that could not stop the run at points a season ago, which was very uncharacteristic of the New Orleans Saints. So I think the easiest thing to do is let's talk about the locks on this team first before we go into the players that are going to be sitting on the bubble. Let's start positionally, because I think you and I probably have some names that come to mind immediately that aren't going anywhere. So let's start from the defensive line and build out. Your locks on defensive line will include Cameron Jordan. It'll include guys like, obviously, your rookies, right? Isaiah Foskey's not going anywhere. But then, your Carl Grandersons, I don't see going anywhere unless Peyton Turner just has a horrendous preseason. I don't see cutting a guy when he's still on a rookie deal. That's just not characteristic considering where the Saints have been with the cap over the last, decade at this point. But that leaves a lot up in the air. And I don't think they're going to cut their free agent signings either. I think that would, and again, unless they have a horrific training camp in preseason. But there's a lot of positions that are still very much up for grabs at that position. When you look at that position, Bob, am I missing any locks? And who are you going to automatically kind of click and drag over to potentially on the roster bubble?
Brendan, the only name that I could potentially put on the roster bubble that I could logically see on the roster bubble would be Malcolm Roach. Yeah, and again, you pointed it out when you said that this was a defensive tackle spot that really contributed absolutely nothing to the defense last year. In fact, they were nothing but a liability. Both as a from a pass rush standpoint, and definitely against the run. Roach was part of that defensive tackle crew, and he's the only remaining holdover that contributed, if to use that term loosely, last year. The other one's Contavis Street, gone. Shai Tuttle, gone. David Onyemata, gone. They used a first-round draft pick on Brian Brzee. You certainly believe that that Brian is a roster lock. They brought in Kalen Saunders. They signed Nathan Shepard, both of whom are expected to, at least if not start, then certainly be a significant part of the rotation. So I would count them as locks. You look at the defensive tackle spot. I can see Roach making it, because outside of Saunders, your first round rookie, and Shepard, you have a bunch of undrafted, formerly undrafted college players. A couple with veteran experience, but nothing significant, nothing as significant as Roach. So Roach is the favorite to nail down a roster spot. But if they bring in a veteran free agent, or if Roach gets vastly outplayed by one of these other unheralded guys, I could definitely see Roach on the roster bubble. You look at the edge, Cam, lock. Granderson, lock. Foskey, obviously, lock. You would think that Tano Passanio is a lock, not only because he's played very well for the Saints in his 2 years there, but he also brings the added versatility of being able to shift inside, at defensive tackle in certain alignments. So I'm not going to put Passanio as a lock, but he would be an absolutely shocking roster cut. And like you said, Peyton Turner. If Peyton Turner wasn't a first-round draft choice, you would have to think that his roster spot is very seriously in jeopardy. But teams just simply do not like to give up on first-round draft choices, really ever, because they view it as an indictment on their scouting department and the people making the draft picks. And for the most part, they're not wrong. Given that Peyton Turner is still on his rookie contract. Again, I'm not going to put him as a roster lock, but I would find him as a very surprising roster cut. Unless he absolutely stinks up the joint. I just see the Saints continuing to give him chance after chance after chance. So, I expect the Saints to keep a total of 10 defensive linemen on their active roster. We just named, let's tick them off real quick. Jordan, Granderson, Foskey, Peyton, Passanio, that's 5 along the edge. Roach, who I would put on the roster bubble. But outside of Roach, you're talking Brzee, Saunders, Shepard. That's 3 of what I think are going to be 5 defensive tackles. So we just named 8 probable locks of a spot that they're going to keep 10 with Roach on the roster bubble. So there's going to be a lot of competition for the back half of this for the roster spots. And frankly, for even at the top part, for playing time early in the season. But I don't see a lot of movement. This is a position where if you know the Saints roster and you're looking at it, it's pretty easy to predict 7, maybe even 8 of the 10 spots here.
Absolutely. And remember, over the years, the Saints have been one of the best in the league in terms of using all, let's say, 8 to 10 defensive linemen throughout a rotation. And that's what's made that defense extremely special and versatile in certain positions. I mean, look at third downs and look at the amounts of speed that they're able to throw out onto the field, because none of those guys are gassed because the rotation works itself out very well. And the Saints have always been good about that and keeping a lot of depth at that position. So, I mean, even if you throw Roach in there, like you said, you have 8, 9 guys, you leaves one spot open for somebody to take it. Again, I would not be surprised if the Saints find some veterans that they want to bring into camp and just see at that position, not because they're not talented at defensive tackle, but because there's a lot of uncertainty
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to defensive tackle. So I could see the Saints certainly bringing in another guy. Let's go to the linebackers, a position where there are some holes. There is some uncertainty, especially after you get past 1 and 2, right? So your locks, Pete Warner, Demario Davis, no particular order. After that, it kind of gets thrown up in the air. I mean, you want to think that Jackson, your draft pick out of App State, is going to step up and fill a role. But it's not like any of us saw him last year either because of injury.
Right.
You have seen the times that Zach Bond has been given the opportunity to step up into that role. And while he is super athletic, and again, I've said this a gazillion times for the people that are loyal listeners and watchers of this, he's uber athletic and he's found a home on special teams for the rest of his career if that's what he wants. And that's fine. But he's a little slow in his decision making. And in his defense, he should have never been drafted with the intent of bumping inside because he didn't do any of that in college. To draft a guy off of his pure athleticism and say, man, if we could bulk him up and throw him inside, that's great. But that's not a third-round pick. That's a guy that you look in day 3, particularly in rounds 6 and 7, and go, you know what? That's a really athletic dude. I wonder if we can make him switch positions.
Yeah.
That makes sense. It's a little critical of the Saints scouting department and front office, which we're typically not for the most part on this show. Or honestly, even in analysis writing, I can't remember over the last 5 years, many times I've been super critical of the front office or their scouting departments because they've knocked it out of the park over the last. Bob's biting his tongue. I mean, you could say it up on the first round picks, right? Like Ruiz, we could say that. You could say it over, Turner, but for the most part, I think a lot of it rides on the fact of how successful 17 was. And I think part of your brain wants to go, oh, that was so successful. So weren't they great in 18? Weren't they great in 19? Weren't they great? Which, they had some hits and they had some misses, certainly. But I don't remember a whole lot of times myself personally being critical. That is one I'll be critical on because it's not that Zach doesn't have the talent to be an NFL player and be productive in his natural position. The issue is they have taken a guy who is talented in his natural position and tried to. It's the old definition of trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah,
and that's the issue with Zach. And so that makes it's super confusing in who's going to fill that Caden Ellis type of role. And you and I have harped on for weeks, maybe months now. Saints need to bring in somebody at linebacker. The Saints need to bring somebody in at linebacker, some sort of veteran guy. And they haven't. And I'm still surprised that they haven't, especially when there's familiar faces on the market. And I know that's the really easy thing to do. And it's the really lazy thing to do is just go get a guy that's played in your system before. But when you get this much further along in the process of the offseason, it makes more and more sense to bring in somebody who has familiarity with the system because then you're not playing catch up because they weren't involved in OTAs and they weren't involved in minicamp. So a very long-winded thing. I think this is the weakest position in terms of total depth on the team. I think you have, all pro level talent, Pro Bowl level talent in Pete Warner if he had stayed healthy last year. And then you have everybody else. And it is the biggest drop from starters to backups on this entire roster.
Yeah, I'll agree with that, and I will say that even with the caveat of being a DeMarco Jackson fan since before they selected him last year. I love scouting this kid. I admit it, and if you guys follow me, for the last several years, you know that there are 4 or 5 players at certain positions that I fall in love with when I scout every year when I do our draft analysis. DeMarco Jackson was one of those guys, in 2022, and the coaches like him too. That's one of the reasons, that and the veteran presence of Zach Bond are the major reasons why they have not signed a veteran linebacker yet. And there's a few very good ones still. Quan Alexander, you have to believe, heads that list because of his experience in the Saints system. But you also have Rashaan Evans, Zach Cunningham, Miles Jack, Deion Jones, Jared Davis, and Anthony Barr. All of those names, even Barr, who's lost a step, would be really good fits in this Saints system. Which may and I know why the Saints are doing it. They won't come out and say it, but it's pretty obvious. They wanted to at least see what they had in DeMarco Jackson and Zach Bond. They wanted to give them the lion's share of the playing time through OTAs, through mini camp, and probably early into camp before they make the determination. If they make the determination that we're just not comfortable with these guys, we need a veteran here for stability. But Zach Bond, in my opinion, is the Traquan Smith of the defense. Zach has had a lot of opportunities to grab a hold of a spot, in the Saints defense. He wasn't going to overtake Demario Davis. There's no doubt. He wasn't going to overtake Quan Alexander. But he had his chance to play well enough to prevent the Saints from using a second-round pick on Pete Werner in 2021. He didn't play that well. Zach has always, and I like Zach Bond's film out of Wisconsin, but only in a certain scheme. I said at the time that if I was in the Pittsburgh Steelers draft room, I would have been clamoring for a guy like Zach Bond. If I was running the Tampa Bay Buccaneers draft room, the way the Buccaneers, scheme their edge linebackers, I would have gone after a Zach Bond. The LA Rams, systems like that. The New Orleans Saints ask too much of their linebackers, that they can't just have one guy in a specialist role, or one guy that does, really doesn't stand out in any single aspect of the game. Zach Bond, as you have said multiple times, Brendan, Zach Bond is a tremendous special teams player. If he makes this roster, and it wouldn't surprise me if he did, if he makes this roster, it's going to be on special teams. But you look at this linebacking core outside of Davis and Werner, who are arguably a top 3, top 5 tandem in the league. But outside of them, you have Zach Bond, special teamer, Ty Summers, special teamer, Andrew Dowell, special teamer. We talked about not knowing what you have in, DeMarco Jackson. So he could be a special teamer. He will play special teams early. 2 undrafted guys who I really like, both of them, Anthony Orji and Nick Anderson. But again, they're undrafted for a reason. You don't want to bank your season, bank your linebacking depth on an unproven, undrafted guy. Of all those names that I just named now, since they lost Caden Ellis, all those other names have 13 games combined of NFL experience on the defensive side, with 12 of those 13 games belong to Zach Bond, with Dowell having the other one. There's not enough experience at these backup spots. I mean, if DeMario or Pete Werner go down for an extended period of time, you got to believe that your defense is going to take a step back anyway. But you only want it to take a step back. You don't want it to completely collapse to the bottom of the league. And if you don't have the necessary depth at that position, at any position, as you know, but since we're focused on this position, if you don't have the necessary depth, you're asking for trouble here.
I think it's really easy going back to that list that you had of current linebackers. It's easy to pick Quan. Very lovable, player during his time in New Orleans. Became a fan favorite very quickly. Has a really good relationship with Demario Davis. I think all those things help, and really flourished in Dennis Allen's system before injury, right? And even after injury, even after coming back, he had a couple really good games. I think it's really easy to go and point to a guy like Deion Jones, though he spent a lot of time with the rival Atlanta Falcons, giving the Saints headaches for years because uber athletic linebacker, LSU Tiger, kid from New Orleans. Yes, at the tail end of his career, but had certainly shown flashes of being one of the better and more athletic linebackers over the past, let's say, seven or 8 years. I think he was a Pro Bowler in 17 or 18.
Yeah.
That would be a perfect guy to bring in. Miles Jack, I think, gets forgotten about because he was playing in Jacksonville.
Right.
But very, very good for a stretch. I mean, there's so many guys with NFL experience. And not just NFL. It's one thing. We throw out that term so loosely sometimes. NFL experience, NFL games played. It's one thing to appear in an NFL game and play 5 to 10 snaps, maybe 15 snaps. It's another thing to have true NFL experience and be a Pro Bowl level player.
Yes.
Right. And so when I talk about a guy like Deion Jones, who just go back and watch some of the tape over the years of when the Saints and Falcons would battle. And yes, the Saints came up on, the upper hand a lot of those times, but Deion Jones was a menace.
Mm-hmm.
Go back and watch some of the Quan Alexander tape, whether you want to pick the Bucks tape or the Saints tape. I don't know if Quan ever actually made a Pro Bowl, but again, an uber athletic linebacker that had some of the best sideline to sideline speed that I'd seen in his time in the NFL. You look at a guy like Miles Jack, like I said, super underrated because he was a part of those Jacksonville teams outside the team that made the AFC title. But man, 44 was everywhere for Jacksonville, and that's why they made the AFC title game that year. I mean, like I said, it's one thing for us to throw out, oh, they've got NFL experience. Well, that's great. A lot of people have NFL experience. A lot of people have cups of coffee in the NFL. But all three of those guys have been legitimate Pro Bowl caliber players in their career. And they're at the end of their career or the back half of it. They're on the back nine. And that's okay. Because the Saints, because they have Demario Davis, who's still playing at a super high level, and they have Pete Warner, who, when healthy, plays at a super high level, they don't need another guy to be playing at a super elite level. They just need a good, we talk about bridge quarterbacks all the time. They kind of need a bridge linebacker until they figure out, well, who's going to replace Demario? Right, because Demario's, 34 years old now?
Mm-hmm.
Right, at some point, you got to look for his replacement, but you also don't want a situation like you alluded to, Bob, where one of those guys gets hurt, and it's like, okay, well, DeMarco, no NFL experience? Come on down. You're the next contestant on. Make your NFL debut. Like, you don't want that to happen. You got to have some sort of bridge there and some sort of leadership, which I think goes super undervalued as well. When you're talking about young guys or guys that are trying like a Bond who is still trying to learn a whole new position, having some sort of leadership there is so important. And sometimes it's hard to find that leadership from your defensive cap. And this is going to sound weird. It's hard to relate leadership wise to your defensive captain, your all pro level linebacker. It's a lot easier for some of these young guys to relate in a leadership sense from a guy who's like 27, 28, 29 years old that had success in the league and is still just trying to prolong their NFL career.
Yeah.
That's a lot more relatable than being like, oh, let me just go up to my all pro captain and try to pick his brain. It's there's just a gap relatability wise for young guys. So I think bringing in a guy in that position is going to be super helpful, not just in terms of like team and talent, but in terms of developing the guys that are going to be behind Demario Davis as well.
Well, and let's be fair too, and play devil's advocate a little bit. It's obvious that the Saints coaches like what they have here, but the term "we like what we have in our room"
Oh man, Whew,
has
I just
just
got goosebumps.
yeah, it's just poisoned all of our psyche. Thank you, Sean Payton, for those PTSD flashbacks. Now he said it over and over and over again, with the wide receiver room, which turned out to be one of the worst in the NFL.
I think it was
I
the
would
worst.
argue one of the worst in NFL history.
Mm.
Once you lost Michael Thomas, but he used that term so often that it does give us all PTSD flashbacks. But in regard, I've already talked ad nauseum at why I like DeMarco Jackson, but I'll defend Zach Bond in with this statement. Leading up to last year, did anybody, and be honest with yourselves, did anybody see Caden Ellis doing what he did when he had to step in for an injured Pete Werner? I liked Ellis coming out of Idaho. I thought he was a solid player, and he gave the Saints some solid snaps. But even in my wildest dreams, I couldn't have seen Caden Ellis having the breakout campaign that he had. So I could understand the Saints putting Zach Bond in this position, hopeful. And Caden, I think Caden was drafted in 2019, so he was in his fourth year, last year, and one of those years was really, he was really shelled by a season-ending knee injury. So really he had 3 years of NFL experience, leading into last year, for his breakout. Zach Bond, 2020, 21, 22, he's going into his fourth season. And again, most of that, just like Caden, was on special teams. So, maybe they see something there that we don't. And you got to give them the benefit of the doubt to a certain extent, because they're with that guy every day in meetings, every day in practice. When we're not necessarily there, we only flip it on and watch the games. You and I have access to practice, certain portions of practice too, Brendan. So that makes us a little bit luckier, than the average fan. So I'll play devil's advocate with Zach Bond to a certain extent. But again, if you're an average fan and you look at this linebacking depth chart, it's scary as hell.
Yeah. Well, there's not a lot of depth to it. The first word of depth chart, there's just not a whole lot there. We'll see how it plays out. I think we're both in agreement that it's not so much roster bubble players. Like, I think that DeMarco has a role on this team. I think Zach Bond has a role on this team, whether that's special teams or whether that is being the third linebacker. I think it's more of, okay, we could talk about roster bubble players at this position if there were more guys at this position.
Right.
Because there's just not. Let's talk about corners. We'll end with safeties because I think safeties is a little bit more interesting. Corner is interesting, though, too, because all of a sudden the Saints have an abundance of it, which hadn't been the case over the last few years. I mean, do we have to roll back the tape to 17? Well, actually, 17 was pretty good. Let's talk about 18, 19. Because I think Ken Crawley gets a lot more pushback from fans than maybe he deserves, because he was really good when there was no reason for him to be good, right?
Yeah.
Like, the expectations for Ken Crawley were not like so low because he was bad, but just low because we're like, I don't know who this kid is. Like, he's from Colorado. Okay, great. Like, what do we know about Ken Crawley? And nobody really knew much about Ken Crawley. And then he played really well. Like, really well. And then, reality kind of caught up, and he still had a good career. He had another stint in New Orleans later where he was wearing like 40 something, which that was a weird. Anytime corners wear anything above the number 40, 40's fine. Anything above the number 40, and you're getting to like fullback range in terms of,
I don't know.
for me. But that's just a personal preference. if you're a corner, keep it between 20 and 40 if you can. But anyway, then you had the Eli Apple, which again, in his defense, as much as he's unliked for some of the things he said about the franchise and about the city and about the fans and just his mother, and there's a lot of different things when it comes to Eli Apple.
There's a list, yeah.
There's a list. For about an 8-game stretch there, he was everything that the Saints needed.
Yes.
Opposite Marshawn Lattimore. And
Yep.
then it didn't come to like, like a stop sign. It wasn't like a nice settle, like let's push the brakes down and just ease into it. It went off of a cliff. It was one of those, like, the very next day you woke up and you're like, whoa, what happened to Eli Apple?
Yeah.
And then you had these years of, we don't really know who are. It's been a lot of inconsistency, but not inconsistency of stretches, like long stretches of bad. It has been very short stretches of good. And I think that's where it's been more frustrating. You get, like I said, Crawley,
Janoris Jenkins, which is a guy that I really was hoping they'd keep around that they didn't. Same.
And then you have the Alontae Taylor played really well. And then he had, he's played really well. You have, I'm missing. Who am I missing?
Adebo, Roby.
Adebo had a good stretch, and then that kind of came back to earth. I think Roby has been kind of what we expected Roby to be, but it's just been a lot of 3 or 4 good games, and then it kind of disappears, and it's kind of a shame because Marshawn Lattimore's been so good.
Yeah.
So now the Saints have an abundance, right? Paulson Adebo's been really good. Alontae Taylor had a really good year last year. Marshawn Lattimore, when healthy, I still put my money as the best defensive back in football. Roby's kind of been what he is, and it's actually been pretty good in terms of depth. The Saints have certainly needed it at times. So right there, you have 4 guys that could be starters, I think, for just about anybody in the league.
Yeah.
When it comes after that, there's still some question marks. But knock on wood, you're allowed to have question marks at corner 5 and 6.
Yeah. You hope that's where the questions are and that they're not higher.
Exactly. So I think for the first time in a long time, the Saints have good depth there. Do you have anybody at the cornerback spot that is on your roster bubble of note? Or do you think – I think the only guy that you could even remotely throw close to that conversation is Bradley Roby. But do you think Roby's pretty secure in his spot on the roster?
I think Roby is fairly secure. People talk about veteran running backs and veteran quarterbacks that their decline doesn't come gradually; it comes very suddenly. The same thing happens defensively with cornerbacks. And I never thought Bradley Roby was an elite, perennial Pro Bowl type of corner, but I always felt like he was solid. He was a guy that you could count on to start a few games, for you if you needed him to, and definitely always a quality guy to go against deeper receiving cores. But there's 2 guys that this team brought in, and we know the Saints love versatility in their secondary. It was a little bit surprising to me that they did not re-sign P.J. Williams to their annual 1-year P.J. Williams contract. But they signed a P.J. Williams clone in Lonnie Johnson, and they drafted a P.J. Williams clone in Jordan Howard. Now both of these guys, you're going to see Lonnie Johnson have CB on his name, near the next to the depth chart. He's a hybrid. He's a slot. He's a slot safety kind of guy. Jordan Howard, he'll have S next to his name on the depth chart, but he brings the same kind of traits. If both Lonnie and Howden play very well, then the Saints might deem Roby expendable. Maybe not to cut him, but maybe to trade, dangle him as trade bait and get maybe a mid to late draft choice out of it to start, stockpiling draft choices. So I wouldn't put Roby on the roster bubble per se, but if there's a guy that you deem expendable, at the cornerback unit, that's the guy, because they're not going to trade, Lattimore. They're not some national. I'm not going to call them experts. Some national morons, have suggested that the Saints may be
the complete opposite way.
Some national morons have suggested that the Saints might have an embarrassment of riches at cornerback, and maybe you need to trade a Debo or Taylor. Cornerback, just like pass rusher, it's one of those positions you never ever have too many of. This is a defense. PFF, I think, called the Saints secondary 19th best in the league. We don't have enough time left in the show to trash on that. Just know that this team finished second in the league in pass defense, with Marshawn Lattimore missing 10 games. They ranked near the bottom of the league in quarterback pressures and hurries. And you had a rookie in Alontae Taylor stepping in for the top cornerback spot when Lattimore was out and Adebo was banged up. This is an elite cornerback unit. One of the, in my opinion, from top to bottom, the best in the league, and from top to bottom, the best in New Orleans Saints history.
Going to your PJ Williams point, PJ Williams remains unsigned.
Yes, he does.
So should there be anything that happens in training camp injury-wise, you know who you're calling. Because that is a guy that, though the last few years had been a guy that was like, were they really bringing PJ Williams back? He certainly slotted and carved out a role for himself over the last 3, and being a very, very useful player in New Orleans. Going to your point of being best, keeping it with the PJ Williams, going to, you said, potentially the best cornerback room the Saints have ever had. Let's go all the way back to some of the younger years of PJ Williams and see where these rooms rank on your list. PJ Williams, Kyle Wilson, Damian Swan, Stanley Jean-Baptiste, Brandon Browner, Delvin Breaux. Saints have came a long way, my friend. A very long way.
And there was a Devontae Harris sandwiched in there. Corey White a few years before that. I mean, the
new Webb.
Yeah. The New Orleans Saints history of cornerbacks. I'm not exactly making a hot take here when I called it the best unit in Saints history. This is a position that has not produced a lot of talent for the New Orleans Saints. You get some good to very good ones. Dave Waymer, Jabari Greer, Tracy Porter, Delvin Breaux, Toy Cook. Those were good players, solid players. You couldn't really say great, not consistently so. Anyway, Marshawn Lattimore, you have great, elite. Alontae Taylor, you have potentially great, certainly rising star. Paulson Adebo, you look like you have very good. Bradley Roby, reliable, experienced starter. This is a unit that you could do so many different things with and can match up against the deepest receiving core in the units in the NFL. And we haven't even, I know this segues us a little bit, we haven't even talked about, we only talked a little bit about Howden and his ability to play the slot. Lonnie Johnson will compete for a role in the slot. And Tyrann Mathieu, titled as a safety, can also step into slot coverage.
Yeah, absolutely. Last name that, or only name I thought you left out there of Saints good, maybe not great, but good corners over the years, Mike McKenzie. Though it was short-lived.
Very good. Yes.
Was definitely what the Saints needed during that time period.
Keenan Lewis, another one.
Yep. Oh, yes. New Orleans boy, Keenan Lewis. See, and that's the shame when, specifically with that position, and I think you made an excellent point, is the Saints have never really had a elite all-pro caliber type of DB. But you can go through and guys like Keenan Lewis, Delvin Breaux, like those guys were above and beyond the best at their position for the team, and they had no team success whatsoever. Like Keenan Lewis and that's a perfect one. Both obviously hometown guys, but like both those guys had Pro Bowl caliber seasons in New Orleans and got completely overlooked because the team was so bad.
Yeah.
But let's move on to safety, a position that, much like wide receiver on the offensive side, it is stacked with a lot of guys that could easily make other rosters. They're all just happening to be fighting for like the same one or two positions on the same team. Tyrann Mathieu a lock.
Yeah.
Easy.
Yeah.
Marcus May, I'm not so sure about because of the legal stuff. Right? It has nothing to do because when he played, I think he was fine. I think they had moments. I think they had moments where it looked like it came together. But I made this point last year, and I don't know if either of us ever looked back to see if it was true. I never felt like I saw Marcus May in back-to-back games. I really don't. Like, I'd have to go back and look, but I do not remember a case where Marcus May was actually active back-to-back games. But towards the end of the season, I think the defense as a whole covered for a lot of mistakes because they were playing so well. But I think towards the end of the year, we started seeing the whole unit gel. And that goes from the front all the way to the back. I don't have a problem with Marcus May. I have a problem with... It's one thing for Alvin Kamara to be in legal trouble that has now gone multiple off seasons. It's another thing when you bring in a guy who could not stay healthy last year, underperformed, to have a lingering thing. And if he were to be suspended for half the season or more, and if I remember contracts correctly, this would be the second year of the 2-year deal that he signed.
Yes.
So if he's suspended for more than half the season, would you just sit down and go, do you want to just cut ties now and call it a day? I don't know. I'm not willing to say roster bubble, but I'm willing to say that like 2 or 3% that he might not make the team because of the legal stuff. Just like keep an eye out for it. I'm not making bold predictions. I'm not going to sit here and Colin Coward everybody and make ridiculous hot takes. I'm saying just keep an eye out for it. Obviously, they're your starters. You could essentially call them both locks. After that, it gets a little fuzzy because they brought in a lot of safeties. Free agency, the draft, and then obviously some guys from last year that are returning from injury, specifically in Smoke Monday, who I think definitely has an uphill battle to climb to make this roster, but was a guy that was turning heads before his injury last year. So, Bob, I think it's really difficult ever to say that a 5th-round pick is a roster lock. But Holden was a guy that the Saints really liked his versatility. And historically, especially in Dennis Allen's reign with the New Orleans Saints defense, he has really liked those hybrid-esque safety players. I am willing to say that Holden will make the team because of the upside that they see. Maybe not the immediate impact he could make now, but the upside they see down the road. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And I'm like you. I wouldn't call him a roster lock, not as a 5th-round pick. But I will say that he already turned some heads in minicamp and through OTAs. With that versatility, with his ability to cover the slot. And I did like his film at the University of Minnesota, and he had to face off against some very, very good wide receivers. In the Big Ten Conference alone. We already mentioned Jordan, and we already mentioned Lonnie Johnson in the last segment with the quarterbacks. I'm not willing to say that Lonnie Johnson is a roster lock either, but they signed him to fill the PJ Williams role. And that was a role that has been extremely crucial and valuable to the Saints defense and Dennis Allen the last few years. This team lost a lot of versatility when they were forced to deal C.J. Gardner-Johnson. And I know the whole emotional spark plug of the unit too, suffered. I'm strictly talking talent on the field. They're hoping that they could fill that PJ and Gardner Johnson role with Lonnie Johnson and Jordan Howden. You look at the safety position, and I know everybody is in love with Smoke Monday, and I understand why. He had some very entertaining games while at Auburn. But just like I said about the receiver position last week, and one of the veterans that they brought in, that everybody just kind of assumes that is going to take a roster job. There's a name at safety that I feel the same way. Jonathan Abram, a former high draft pick, former first round draft pick, former former Raider teammate of Derek Carr, Brian Edwards, etc. Abram has never really fit into the NFL. He's not a cover safety, first and foremost. In fact, he's a downright liability there. But he'll bring the lumber. He's a hitter. He's a very physical guy down near the box. If he makes this team, that's where it's going to be. Kind of like the role that Malcolm Jenkins played best. When the Saints moved Jenkins into coverage, especially later in his career, it was an ugly scene. But when Jenkins was at the line of scrimmage, he was a difference maker. If they use Jonathan Abram that way, then Abram could really find a role on this team. If they use him in coverage, especially with a looming suspension to May, and they're wanting to move Lonnie Johnson and Tyrann Mathieu around a little bit, if they think that Jonathan Abram can be a deep support safety, then this man is on the roster bubble, because that's going to get extremely ugly extremely fast.
Yeah, Abram, I'll throw another Saints defensive back, a guy like Roman Harper, who is much better in the box than he was in coverage. That's another guy right about the same time period as Malcolm Jenkins as well. I think for me, when I look at this position, I have concerns, even though it's a pretty stacked position in terms of depth. I have my concerns if somebody were to get hurt.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I don't think there's an immediate fill for Marcus May if he misses the amount of time that he did last year. Right. I don't think there's an immediate, like, okay, we could just plug and play, and that's a similar type of player. I think you could get away with it if Honey Badger were to get hurt, but there's no one in the league like Tyrann Mathieu, and that's what's made him so special over the years. I think there are similar types of players on this roster, not to the same degree of talent, but I have a fear, like I said with Marcus May, because he was hurt a lot of last year. There is uncertainty with a suspension. I don't think you really have a ball hawking guy that could sit there and kind of float around at free safety like they can on this roster. That's where I get concerned. You have a lot of guys that are these hybrid guys.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I say, like, kind of fits the role of Tyrann Mathieu to an extent. You have a lot of those hybrid guys, and I don't know if any of those hybrid guys could really go back and play center field at free safety like Marcus May could, or even like how Marcus Williams could back in the day for New Orleans. That's where my concern lies with that position. I don't see the Saints going and signing any more safeties because I think it would just be outrageous.
Yeah.
But when I say that out loud, I go, you know what? If there was a guy in free agency that they liked to bring in to see if he could compete to just be a special teamer that fit more of that Marcus May role, more of that center fielder mold, I'd be okay with it. I just don't know if that player exists in free agency right now, and I think it would be redundant to bring in just another safety at this point, unless that safety had experience. Now, we talked about PJ Williams. That wouldn't work either, because PJ can't play center field safety. He's going to be that hybrid guy. So that's where my concern is with that position. Even though they're loaded in terms of depth, they're loaded in terms of this hybrid position that has been created by the NFL over the last I don't know, however many years you want to call it. You look at a guy like Malcolm Jenkins, and that was kind of one of the first guys that we saw be that hybrid spot. Now everybody's doing it. But the Saints have an abundance there. They don't have just a free roaming, free safety, and that's concerning. In terms of like roster bubble guys, I think Smoke Monday right out the gate is on that list. I think Abram, like you said, is on that list. I would be willing to bet that Lonnie's a lock, that Howden's a lock. Obviously, your starters from last year are a lock. But I think there are going to be some disappointed Saints fans because I think, like I said at the beginning, like considering this team's missed the playoffs the last 2 years, they're loaded with talent all over the field. And there's going to be guys that end up being surprise cuts that are going to upset people. Because that's how talented, at least on paper, this team is.
Well, yeah, and it's usually fan favorites that end up causing the outrage. When they get cut, we've seen it with the running back positions. In two or three of the last few years. So I could see Smoke Monday being the type of name that enrages people if he gets cut. Or Shaq Davis, the undrafted rookie receiver on offense. One of those guys. And again, just like we said last week, just like we will tell you throughout training camp, just because a guy plays really well and makes a few plays late in the fourth quarter of a preseason game does not mean you should expect him to make the roster. You need to watch for those type of guys to see if they're making plays on a daily basis in training camp, against the ones and twos from their own team. And also, and here's the key, special teams, kick coverage in camp, kick coverage in preseason games. That's how a lot of these guys, Smoke Monday, Ty Summers, Zach Bond. That's how Zach Bond continues to hold on to his roster spot. That's how guys make the team. That's how guys keep their spots on the team. Are the kick coverage units, the underappreciated units of the NFL.
I was told at a very young age that if you got really good at special teams, you could find your way onto a college scholarship, and you might just find yourself on an NFL roster or a CFL roster, whatever. You don't have to. Sometimes it's not about being great at your position, wide receiver, tight end, whatever. Sometimes it's just about being great at something that is extremely undervalued in sports, and that's special teams. So that's why I absolutely hate these rules of like the new kickoff, like trying to kickoffs and all that stuff. Like you're going to eliminate players from living out their dreams because some of those guys, that's all they do. They are special teamers for 4 or 5 years, and that's it. I mean, look at some of the guys. The Saints have had some really good special teamers over the years. Gray, you look at, I went to Pittsburgh for a little bit. Drawing a blank this late. Arthur Mallett.
Mallett. Yeah. Art Mallett
was another guy who was phenomenal on special teams, and that's how he made his living. The Saints have had those guys. I'm sure if you have fans of other teams out in the chat, you guys have your own guys that have just made an absolute living on special teams for years and years and years. So, yeah, we can talk about some special teams roster bubble guys a little bit, but there's not really any controversy this year in New Orleans. Some may say,
not yet.
Right. Some may say Will Lutz if he has a bad preseason because he didn't kick to his standards last year. But I don't think there's any real controversy coming up, at least this point in the season. Well, Bob, we are inching closer and closer to training camp, which means we're inching closer and closer to Bob Rose content dropping every day, which, I mean, it has all summer long. So for the people that have missed out on reading some excellent content by you, where can people follow you on the World Wide Web? And I appreciate the compliment, Brendan. I have taken a bunch of days off early in July so far. I published 2 pieces yesterday.
but went the first, second, third, and today without publishing. So I think I'm done with my mini exile. I got a couple pieces up here brewing, that I'll publish tomorrow. But in the meantime, you can follow my work, and my work through June, May, and all the prior months, and along with upcoming pieces on Facebook, Bob Rose. I'm over on Twitter at Bobby R2613, and all of our work, collective works, can also be found on our network, the Saints News Network, at Saints News on Twitter. And obviously, in addition to all your Bayou Blitz show content, all of our articles can also be found on the Bayou Blitz Facebook page and at Bayou Blitz Pod on over on Twitter. Make those two pages grow, folks. We want to make that the Bayou Blitz Facebook page and Bayou Blitz Twitter page. We want to grow that to the point where it's exclusive. It's by invite only. And you guys already have your foot in the door. All you need to do is keep growing this page, this group, and make it a source of power for you.
And for myself, you can follow me over on Twitter, Instagram, and now Threads, which I'm not super familiar with. I mean, I created my account because it's new, it's a thing. But you can follow me at all of those places at BT Boylan. Those guys over there at Saints News do great work, especially here during the off season, giving you guys the latest and greatest in New Orleans Saints news. Obviously, as we get closer and closer to training camp, you're gonna have to bookmark it, whether it's on your cell phone, on Safari or Google Chrome or whatever you use on your laptops. You're gonna have to put your notifications on Twitter for Bob and Kyle and John and Ross, because those guys are going to be working extremely hard throughout training camp in the preseason, and then obviously the regular season. As crazy as it sounds, it's right around the corner too. We are coming up quick on all of it, so make sure you follow all those guys over at Saints News. You can continue to support us with the Bayou Blitz podcast. I'm not going to repeat everything. Bob already did a great job for you guys. I will say this though, this is going to be news to Bob as well, but I have got my hands on some more giveaway content. So as we approach training camp, as we approach the preseason, make sure to follow us over at Bayou Blitz Pod on Twitter and the Facebook groups for the Bayou Blitz, because we will be doing some really cool giveaways. But until then, guys, follow all of those guys over at the Saints News Network, and Bob and I will see you next Wednesday for another edition of the Bayou Blitz podcast. Until then, find some peace, spread love, practice positivity. See you next week.